modular difference between small tasks and if they can perform small tasks, or whether they will outcompete the humankind, take over, and that makes us feel powerless. It makes us feel like we can't control, we can't govern, we don't know what to protect citizens and I would think that, if we have to talk about how to define AI, for example, let's think of it as, for example, from my perspective, from data ethics perspective, it's very complex data processing, and it's very, very large systems of complex data processing. And what are the ethical implications of that? We have things in terms of mass citizens we have to control and think of.
Change, even Mozilla applied in the thinking from the better decision making as opposed to the trustworthy AI, which is the term coined by the European Union's ethics guideline, and what that means. And it has 3 pillars of being legal, ethical, and robust. But at the moment is more what we see is that it's a marketing term, and I hope that this community can turn it into something more than that. Just on that narrative setting, for me, what's very interesting, I looked at my emails. When was the first time in a work setting we started talking about artificial intelligence internally on the team, beyond just sharing some newsletters? And it was mid-2016, talking about the formation in the fall of the partnership on AI by Google, Facebook, IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft. And I think it still is the reality that already in 2016, these companies formed a partnership that now we are a member of.
About correlation-based decision support systems, right? How does that work with a larger audience? It's not going to work. Yeah. But it's important that we keep in mind that this is what we're talking about, or I think that's at the core of what we're talking about when we're trying to identify the challenges that we have, because we are looking more and more at these correlation-based decisions instead of causation, right? And this is a fundamental change, because we just assume that because there is massive amounts of data and we can detect patterns in it, then that needs to guide our decisions. And this is what's problematic, and this is what we need to understand better, and then also take precautions, because we are not going to get away from that anymore, and it's helpful, like that, if it's evolved, people's...
to report myself to the police officer, but we expect tech companies to...
I think at a company, and this is, I think, kind of an atypical perspective, but one that I think has changed, is not enough. It's not enough our expectation for corporate accountability when it comes to the deployment of artificial intelligence systems. So one of the things that we're doing on our team is we're in frequent conversation with regulators about how we can kind of find an in-between space or apply their existing regulatory framework, how it should be better applied to AI and managing its risks, particularly the human rights framework. And then finding ways that we can, through kind of a light touch approach to regulation, introduce greater accountability, either through different reporting requirements for impact assessments and things like that. So I think the conversation is gradually shifting. I think there's a growing consensus that self-regulation is not enough, and the new reality that companies have to deal with is, what is that regulatory landscape going to look like? How can it protect society, but allow the technology to be developed in a way that is beneficial?
Yeah, agree. Should Facebook moderate Facebook, or should government regulate Facebook?
Sorry, one more time.
Sorry, I said moderate and regulate. Should Facebook regulate Facebook, or should...
And does by itself, by creating some new law that then by definition fixes everything, or in a technological space we think of it as a technological fix, and we create this system, for example, in terms of content moderation, we create a system that can moderate everything, and that's it. It doesn't work like that anymore, governance. Governance is law, it's culture, it's education, it's with the AI. We actually make it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd second that. At the same time, I would also warn against this narrative of, do we need regulation? Of course we need regulation, and all these companies and processes are already heavily regulated. There's no such thing as an unregulated Facebook. There are privileges on liability that are hugely important when it comes to Facebook. This is an active regulation. There is copyright regulation that is highly complex and that has been around for many, many years. So it's more like what is good regulation and what is bad regulation applied to these actors. And and we also should probably, I mean, there has to be someone here on the stage who says that Facebook is just an asshole company, right? And they sort of dug their own grave. I mean, it's not a grave yet, but the pit, you know, that they'll fall into, because they were just so ignorant about all the problems that they created, and they still are, that everyone is really aggressively attacking them now, although in many countries they are still basically the place for people to exchange information freely. You know, in authoritarian countries it's still great to have Facebook because there's no one else there to provide these services. So it seems a little unfair, but it's not, because you know, it always also depends on how these companies, but also state institutions behave vis-à-vis the demands that the publics have. And this is what we need to find a balance, you know, to come up with good regulation that addresses that without harming, for example, free speech or other kinds of freedoms. And this is really terribly hard.
Yeah, go ahead.
For me, this is a power question. We can talk more details about the whole content moderation question. Just to bring it back a little bit closer, you mentioned the autocratic countries as well. For me, the specificities of these specific decision-making processes make it interesting to see that these governments implement decisions with different technologies. And is there anything around AI that makes it specifically dangerous or risky, that creates different thresholds that we need to put in place? And for instance, just to go back to the Facebook example, they just announced that they would still allow government propaganda as they have for the past decade or so. So it's not just around the technology they use, but absolutely the policies. It never is, yeah.
Yeah, here's a question I have. I mean, I've seen, you know, we've all seen the European Union fine Google and fine Facebook billions of dollars. But you know, these companies make billions of dollars in just a few months. How do you go about, you know, actually punishing these companies in a way they actually feel it?
Well, I think first,
Telling silence, yeah.
I don't know the answer, you know, like.
And not only the punishment, but what we see is that probably Facebook will perform better this quarter than ever before, even though I don't think it has been demonstrated more how terrible they did to individuals and societies this year. So the question is, why are we still buying into this model?
But I also think that we, like these fines, for example, and the new laws we're creating in these groups, where I think we could kind of choose to look at them as symptoms of change. And change, it doesn't happen very fast all the time, but it consists of different things. And we're having, like, I've at least seen within working in this field within the last, even just the last 5 years, an incredible change in how we are addressing the risks and the issues of Facebook and Google and the way they deal with things in the press, in normal speech. I remember going into a room and having to fight for these things. And now when I go in, we have people nodding, and I'm sure anyone sitting here has the same, that it's getting so easy to talk about. But that of course doesn't mean that it's happening, that the change are happening. But it means that we have a support for.
And if I may, it's not so much, because sometimes you get the impression it's about, you know, having your revenge on Facebook because they're making so much money, you know, and they behave so badly, so we need to punish them for that. But of course, what we are trying to, and this is where your question is going, how can we change their behavior? And I think it's not going to work with fines. Of course, they can hurt, and they should be high enough to hurt, but they also need to be really well justified. But I see as the main problem with the large companies, and we shouldn't just talk about the large companies because they are specific, but of course they pose one of the biggest problems. With the large companies, it is the lack of accountability, right? Because they just don't give a damn about what we think, what our governments think, what societies think. And this is what we need to address. We have to come up with better ideas for holding them accountable so that they can't just say, oh yeah, we'll throw some AI on it, or we'll hire a couple of thousand people in Indonesia to moderate our content, and then this problem will probably go away. This is not going to work. We need to make them accountable to individuals and to other stakeholders so that they feel the pressure that they're really doing some good stuff, right? I'll always say that at the same time. But where they fail, that needs to be addressed. And we need to be able as citizens to address that.
I love the idea of throw some AI on it. It's just so funny to me.
I think one thing I would add, I agree entirely with what Matthias was saying, but I think one lesson that we should draw from this is that and it's an obvious one, but we should remind ourselves that the market does not value responsible AI, and something that Fanny just pointed to, like Facebook shares the share price keep going up, so that the market does not value this. So how do we create a market through appropriate regulatory interventions that makes responsible AI and investments in explainability and accountability in AI systems and like a prerequisite to developing this technology, and not just something that a company will do out of its own goodwill, and if they can convince investors that this is a worthwhile cost. To just give you guys an example, at our company, there's 30 to 40% of product development is explainability. That gets difficult to justify when you're getting to the end of a financing round. Well, when you're trying to raise the next one, and you're running out of cash, and you have all the goodwill in the world. When the rubber hits the road, and you're burning X amount of money per month, it gets tough to justify because you have to keep the company going, right? So. We need to think, I think, even more about, instead of regulatory protections, but the type of incentive structures that could be built into the market to privilege, the investing in those technologies. It could be through procurement, strategic procurement efforts, and pilot programs that are shoring up that technology as like the fundamental base layer. And then we might get somewhere new.
If I just add, when you say that the market is not valuing responsible AI, that means that just let's lose all these adjectives for a moment. Malavika Jairam has been talking about this for years. Where are all the conferences and companies developing irresponsible AI or AI for social bad or untrustworthy AI? And so, for me, this means that already there is a market failure. And there are existing regulations that we need to apply first. And to go back to your point about the complex information processing, if in 1955 they would have chosen this complex information processing to describe this method instead of artificial intelligence to get more funding, would it be more appealing to lawmakers to sit in front of a blanket paper and write a law on it? I doubt it. I think we should look at the impacts on individuals and societies and first enforce and also find the gaps and regulate that area, not the technology.
Yeah, you were talking before about companies, and it reminded me of something that Matthias, you were talking with the panelists about, and I was eavesdropping, where you're saying, you need a license to practice medicine, you need a license to drive a car, but anyone could just make AI. Should we have licenses to AI? Do you think that would help?
I'm skeptical about that, but it was just, we started discussing this with Phil mentioning that there's apparently a proposal in Canada that you can probably talk about where that is suggested. I'm skeptical about this because I'm all for having changes in curricula, for example, computer engineers and computer scientists learning more about responsible work with what they're doing. That would apply to biologists, and it does apply to biologists, to people who work with genetic engineering and so on and so forth. It's not working there either, by the way. My wife studied biology. She didn't have one ethics class in her entire program. So that is hard to address. I don't know whether we should use this licensing idea to probably increase the pressure or something. It's the first time I start thinking about this. I would talk about a little about more about standardization, but probably we finish that licensing idea first.
Yeah. Well, I know that you guys mentioned you want to get more time than usual for Q&A, so think of questions now. But the last question I'll ask you, Gry, and then anyone can answer. You were talking before about all the kind of headlines we're seeing about all the problems being addressed with social media companies. Do you feel like there might be a placebo effect where if you're not a Mozilla MozFest audience member, just a regular person seeing the headlines of Facebook did this and this is what the government, Zuckerberg as a congressional hearing, do you think there might be a placebo effect where it's like, oh, the problems are being solved, let me go back to using Facebook? Do you think that kind of explains the increasing stock price? Do you think there's a placebo effect there?
Actually, I don't know. I think I was sitting and thinking here. I was listening to also what Element AI, you as a company, and I was thinking that I wanted to ask you because Element AI, for example, is known as a kind of the sustainable company and thinking about these questions. And then I hear that I got possibly surprised that you got a big round of funding, and I was wondering how much of that kind of profile was part of it, and maybe that's where we have to start in what we talk about, and not so much because I always thought that it was problematic that we put everything on the shoulders of the consumers and consumer action and these things. This has to be solved by the companies that are building things, the investors that are investing in specific solutions and asking for specific results, and it has to be solved in law. So I think that's more, maybe there's a placebo effect, maybe there's not, but in the end, it is something that has to be solved by some of the actual responsible actors that are building these infrastructures. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but that's more changing the direction of the question.
Yeah. All right, so we'll end it there because they wanted to hear what you guys had to say. So are there any questions in the audience? We have one up here, we have one over there. I'll let Kevin decide who we hear from first. Him right there.
Hi. So I agree that self-regulation for companies doing AI is not a good idea, but what options are there for small startups? What can we do to move away from that model of things?
I guess that's directed to me. Cool. I mean, anybody can answer that too, but I'll start. I think it's important. One thing that we've learned, and just give you a bit of background, we're a company that was founded 3 years ago, and we now have 500 employees. So it was the scaling of happened very quickly. There's the phases when I was hired where we were hiring 20 employees every 2 weeks. And so when you're doing that type of growth, it's very difficult, I think, to ensure that the ethical framework you've developed gets operationalized, socialized, and passed down to all the new hires. But you have to do that from the beginning. Otherwise, it's really hard to catch up. So I would say that's one thing. Two, invest early on in an explainability team. This is a core component of I'm looking for a word, but of AI that can be that is lawful and that can be contested and that will be more just. So those are two things, and then something that we're working on now is to look at different types of impact assessments on products that are a little bit more mature. Because as you probably know, if you're working in a startup, the product roadmap can also be a bit of a moving target. So do you invest heavily into a kind of a new process for this design when you're not even sure that it's going to be something that you roll out, right? So I think it's a tough game a tough negotiation to do, but also start early with the type of, if you know that the main risk of your system might be bias and discrimination, which is often the case, it is in some of our products, then just start early, So I think that's what I would say. And then start speaking to regulators. Companies don't always have to always have the budget early on for a policy team, but executives, engineers, anybody can do this. Have regular conversations with your regulators, and to get to know the regulatory framework in which you're situated, and help them get to know what type of technology you're building and what some of those risks are, and then you can come to an appropriate set of policy options that can allow your company to grow and hopefully in a way that protects people.
Patty, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I also have one suggestion. I think for startups, it's probably quite upsetting to see how law and all the policy conversations are targeted at these main actors, especially if you come with a genuine purpose of why your company exists. And so what I would recommend, we are trying to create a common language and narrative around automated decision making, and we call it this myth-busting exercise that Mozilla and Daniel Ufer, our fellow, is working on, hosted at Access now. And we are looking for contributors who help us create truth and demystifying all this bullshit around it. And so, because it matters to you what the tech can achieve, but also the limitations, like both the skills and the limitations. So if you're interested, then talk to us.
No, get
Okay. Next question, up here.
Hi, I have two remarks and one question. So first remark, the first transatlantic boats or ships didn't have lifeboats on them. The first cars came without seat belts, and people were flying out of windows when they were in an accident. What I'm saying is that industry was, throughout history, very bad at effective self-regulating something that was obvious from the beginning. So here's my question. How do we make this whole process of regulation and self-regulation and whatever lies in between move away from this spectacle of here's 5 people on stage, we're going to save the world in 1 hour, and then we're going to go for a beer, to the place where we go, okay, you do this, I'll do this, and you do this, and in the end, hopefully, every ship will have a lifeboat, and every car will have a seatbelt.
We're actually going to save the world in 40 minutes, but you can take that.
Yeah, that's really unfair. I think I thought we'd come up with a solution for it. But seriously, yeah, of course you're right, and this is also, I think, the 4 of us agree on that. That everyone has to work on different parts of this problem. And even saying this problem is a problem, because we're not looking at one problem with one solution, but we're looking at a ton of different challenges that need to be solved. And one of the ideas is that, for example, like in the car industry and in other industries, there can be better standardization that then at the same time means that people in companies know better what to do, how to develop their stuff for it to be, for example, more transparent and allow for better accountability and explainability. And then the regulator can, for example, decide to give some liability privileges, because if you apply these standards, then if something goes wrong, you can at least prove that you've used the state-of-the-art testing and whatever it is. And I also think that it will take a long time to come up with all of this. And again, it's never done. In Germany, I don't know the numbers in other countries, but in Germany, we still have 3,000 fatalities each year on the roads, right? That is a very high price we accept for mobility, right? But it has been much higher before, and everyone is still working on this. It's in the end, it's about society coming to sort of a conclusion on what we are willing to accept.
Agree. You want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about mentioning the cars and everything, and if we think of the history of cars and pollution and all these things, then we can think back in the 1950s where cars were polluting a lot, and we were building there were these gigantic American cars going around, for example, which was the most popular cars. Then we get the 1970, there's the Clean Air Act, regulatory approach. Then you get scientists that are tracing pollution back to cars, and then everything evolves with every group has their own expertise that they work together with on one goal. The next goal is, of course, if we could get electric cars. But it's more to say that every stage and every actor has their own expertise that we somehow have to. That's what I'm hoping that we can kind of do in these kind of forums. This is an awareness raising exercise, and hopefully whatever this exercise gets into, it will feed into these processes of regulatory frameworks, of engineering, of scientists that are looking into the problems and the risks of AI. And then in the end, we'll probably be somewhere where, for example, we have a scandal like the Volkswagen scandal, where you have engineers that are actually prosecuting for building cheat devices for cars that are polluting too much. So I think this is something we can learn from history.
Yeah.
And
Fanny, you want to?
Yeah.
Yes, I have a few concrete suggestions how to not how to save the world, but how to solve some of these problems. So first of all, I am a human rights lawyer, so if I don't believe in saving the world, then who will? And I hope you join me in this. But so the concrete topic, there are very basic areas where even though we still believe in the European values and fundamental rights frameworks and the enforcement of it, but still there are failures already. So there are two areas. We can talk about AI as much as we want, but as long as we don't have proper basic online protections for privacy, for instance, then what are we even talking about here? Let's not let the European Union get away with not concluding the e-privacy reform. That's one. And the other one, the EU, there are EU-based companies that are manufacturing technology that is being sold outside the European Union, and it's used to kill, to surveil journalists, human rights defenders, political opponents. So surveillance export control is another very concrete topic where we can all get better results in order for any AI-related regulation to be effective and meaningful.
Great, and Philip, you want to chime in?
Yeah, thanks. I want to make 2 points. I think in response to the question, which may not be super satisfying, but I think, like Matthias said, it's an ongoing effort. It's gonna be you chip away at it progressively with a group of people, maybe even people here today. But last week, Fanny and I were at a conference that Element AI organized with Mozilla to do kind of just that. We got together 15 different people from 15 different organizations across stakeholder groups, and we spent 2.5 days together trying to hash out what a regulatory framework for AI could look like, or a governance framework, whatever you want to call it, from shoring up expertise on AI and its risks within different government departments, so that they're able to more meaningfully apply their legislation, give it with giving regard to AI's risks, or to have different reporting mechanisms. So I think it's gonna happen progressively. I think we've seen that not a lot across the world, not a lot of attention has been placed on this in at least the national AI strategies. But that's something that we have to do more work on, and it's going to happen progressively. On that note, I'd like to just highlight. We talk about cars, but I often think about the aviation system as as an example of a space that has been highly innovative, has become progressively more safe over time. There's still a lot of issues related to pollution, but even that I think will be changing in the next generation. But it's an extremely sophisticated and onerous regulatory infrastructure, from standardization to certification schemes to oversight, continuous monitoring. It didn't happen overnight. It took about 80 years, and then it served as a good model for something like complex drone operations, and they've borrowed bits and pieces from it in kind of a weak licensing process to provide some oversight and also bring those operations along to a place where they'll be subject to the more rigorous ambit of the regulatory framework. So I think we've done this before in other industries. We can do it with AI. We're starting at the very beginning. And then another thing I'll say, and I realize we're almost running out of time, but
No, we're not. We're about to enter the regular Q&A. So yeah,
okay, cool.
Yeah.
Is we have to think about new ways of doing data governance. And there's been a few sessions at MozFest on data governance, and specifically on the opportunity that something like data trusts could present. I also saw a session I wasn't able to attend on data unions, but we need to think of more ways of, from the very beginning, governing how we use data and having more democratic representation and how we make choices about how data should be used, greater accountability. I think it starts there. So I think a lot of the AI governance questions may be solved through different models and approaches to data governance.
Great. We have some time for actually one more question. I'll let Kevin decide. Nice.
Hi. I almost wasn't expecting that. just to build on the reference to the aviation industry and the increased regulation, incremental regulation over time, that seems to have been happening in parallel, or maybe actually directly against greater rights of workers in that industry. And I'm really curious as to how you see the governance, growing governance of AI without the loss of kind of worker power, so that this emergent economy serves people economically, but also without the loss of accountability that comes from taking human beings out of more and more aspects of that governance.
Ben, do you want to?
To the second part, and then I'll maybe let you. So on the accountability piece, for instance, one key recommendation from the Council of Europe Human Rights Commissioner's paper on these 10 steps to unbox AI, one of the key recommendations is to always have either a natural or a legal person identified as accountable for the decision. So I think that's the answer. Like, we cannot move away from that governance structure.
Was the question related to workers' rights more about the use of automation and autonomous systems in aviation, or about conditions for workers in more generally?
To be honest, both. I think there's something that happens just psychologically once more and more governance is around automated systems that has the psychological effect of removing the person from the center. That also makes accountability harder. And then the issue of economic prosperity for human beings within that field as well. I think, yeah, they feed each other. The minute we start focusing so much on automated systems, the less important the human being becomes, the easier it is to justify not paying them a living wage, or they are less integral to the system, the harder it is to manage accountability, and so on and so forth.
Okay, I'll try and answer some of those questions. I think there are a few sub-questions. But it reminds me of a conversation Matthias and I were having beforehand about the Boeing MAX 8s and the use of autonomous systems. Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is that as in aviation, the use of autonomous systems, or just in the AI ecosystem more broadly, I think we should be very careful not to attribute accountability to anything other than a human. And in some case, that might be a legal person or might be a physical person. But I think that we should not be confused about that. Is the accountability and liability lies with a person. And then with regards to workers. Yeah, I mean, there's the displacement of workers and the devaluing of workers. This is a problem, and this is something that companies and governments also, I mean, civil society more broadly has to address, and there should be policies in place, possibly with AI industries that are contributing to this, participating in programs to upskill, retrain workers, or should they so desire, or have some type of other compensation scheme. These are some of the options that could be considered to alleviate some of the dislocation that workers will feel. And anyway, I hope that answers in part at least some of your question.
Anyone else want to chime in on that? Okay, well, I guess we can end the panel there. We can give a big round of applause for our panelists on stage. Coming up next, we have a long break. We'll be back at 3:15 where we have one more talk and one more panel. I'll see you guys soon. Thanks.
We will draw for the Sonos first.
Okay, so no speaker.
Yeah. So we're gonna draw that. All right, it's 3 o'clock. It is time for the all-important raffle drawing. Who's here for the raffle drawing? All right, who's gonna win? Okay, good, good. All right, the first thing we're going to draw for is for the Sonos speaker. So Sam B is our guest drawer today. So Sam, do you want to do the honors? Stir them up. Close your eyes. Okay, and the winner is, it's a blue ticket. The top letters, and they matter today. I won't mess this up. Well, I might, but the AD, everybody's like, oh, I'm doing good so far, right? 748455, and the 3 letters that matter are, numbers that matter are 544. Do we have a winner? Anybody have AD 748455? 544. No winners. All right, we're going to put this up on the Mozilla Twitter account. And if we don't have a winner by 3:45, we will redraw for a new winner. All right, and now for the Apple Watch. Ooh, anticipation rises. Sam tries to open a box. Ooh. Ooh. All right, here we go. Stir it up good. Close your eyes. Eyes are closed. I can verify that. And we have a winner. All right, this is an orange ticket. Do you have an orange ticket? The number at the top is AD 394650. And the three numbers that matter are 931. It's only slight. No, it's not rigged. I promise. The winner. Do we have a winner? Come here. Come up on stage. Show me your ticket. AD. We have a winner. Woo! All right. All right, so the Apple Watch is taken, but if you're still hoping for the Sonos, don't go anywhere till 3:45. Maybe the winner will check on Twitter and find it, but maybe they won't, and we'll redraw at 3:45. So thank you, guys.
Can I get a photo of you with the ticket?
Let's do it out there, and we'll give him a try. Were you going just for the Apple Watch?
Hey, what's up? Pretty good. Yeah, Johnson's wondering how much time she has. It'll be 5 minutes. Audience Q&A. Yeah, we'll talk about them in this panel. Sure, yeah, let's do it. Audience Q&A after that. Okay. Cool. Yeah, it's great. It's fun. It's my first MozFest. Oh, really? Nice. Yeah, this is good so far. Oh, you texted me. Sweet. Oh, thanks. Oh, yeah, and you're also doing 2 days in a row. I don't think a lot of people are doing that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Get it in. Yeah, I think it's just you and Katarzyna and...
Yeah, no, really. First she spoke and I did a panel after her, now I'm speaking.
Yeah. That's really funny. You guys, yeah, dynamic duo. You should tell her that. She might be your friend, but like in disguise.
My friend is into jewelry. I don't think that's our thing.
She might have an alter ego that you don't know about.
That's true. That's true. I should ask.
Yeah. Are you my friend?
Are you into jewelry?
Yeah. Are you into jewelry? Cool. Oh boy. Yeah, I would not want my face just like right there like that.
That's weird. Really fake. I'm glad it's not there.
Yeah. I'm sure it can be. I'll ask Emily. Change it. Do you send me tweets? Let's see these tweets. Oh. The moderator sucks.
They don't tag it.
So we'll never know.
No, if that
Yeah.
happens.
Right.
Are you normally using that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I am. I am. Why do you ask?
Oh,
Why do you ask?
I'm just curious because everyone's flying from some random
Far off
It's
place.
really
Yeah.
odd.
Yeah, I forget this is like kind of more of a European focused type of
Yeah.
show.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, the first day I was talking to Lyon,
Yeah.
France. Second day I was talking to Toronto. No, Montreal.
Ah, okay.
Today I was talking to. No, yesterday I was talking to this guy from Spain. So
Oh, yeah, yeah.
seems like all over the place.
All over the place. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, not so bad. It's almost done. Yeah, it's like 5 minutes left. And then you're done, and then you get to live it up. That's at least what I'll do.
Oh, bottle of champagne.
Bottle of champagne, just pop it, run through the streets drinking, going crazy. Will you be at the closing ceremonies later today?
What is it closing ceremony?
I think so. Yeah, I
What
saw
is
that
that?
somewhere. Let me see if I can pull up the details. I don't think it's too involved. Let's see. I have a little document where I keep all my Mozilla links. Nope. Playbook. I think Monday, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday. Closing celebration. Stick around to from 5 p.m. onward. Oh, it's here. Oh, it's literally right after. So 5 p.m. onward at Ravensbourne.
Maybe I should stick around. I was actually thinking about going to Covent Garden.
I don't know that.
There's like some place in London that they said it's like worth sightseeing.
Okay. Have you been here before?
I have, but I always come here for work, so I only get like a day, half a day.
Yeah.
Sightseeing.
Yeah.
I know usually well around the hotels.
Yeah. Yeah, it's never the real London though.
Yeah.
Or real anywhere. Wait, where are you from originally?
Turkey.
Turkey, got it. People, I think I've heard people love Turkey. Like, doesn't it get rave reviews of like best places to live, like Istanbul?
I'm not sure about best place to live. It does definitely get best place to visit.
Yeah, maybe that's what I
But
saw.
live, I don't know. That's a bit too ambitious.
Just visit, but don't live here. Just
Yeah, just,
come
you
for a
know.
little bit
Have some fun and then get out of there.
and get out of there. Yeah, I always see people like highly rank it, I guess, for visit.
Yeah.
That's cool.
I mean, there are people who love living there.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure it's a little too much.
In what way?
Oh, it's really crowded, and I'm saying like like I know New York. It's really crowded in Istanbul. Like
Oh, what's the population
20
like?
million that we can count. So it's
For the
like
whole
really
country or for the whole?
For the city. I know exactly. It's like freaking crowded.
That's more than twice New York. That's a big city. That's a big population.
Big city, and I don't know how many we don't count.
Very good point.
It's not. It's terribly organized. The traffic is terrible. Um,
Nice.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like for visiting, it's like chaotic, so exotic. And for living, it's like
Yeah.
just want a metro, like proper subway.
Oh yeah, tell me about it. Know that life. I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
At least you're in London now. For a little bit.
I like London. I think it's pretty cool.
You can
So
stay.
far.
You can move here. It's an option. You can just stay. Just stay. Ooh,
Yeah,
more
that's
tweets.
what I'll say when I go through the border. I'll be like, I decided that's where I'll go.
I've decided this is my home.
Yeah. Take that.
Take that.
So maybe if you say it with enough confidence.
Yeah. That's how it works.
Exactly.
That's how customs works. I live here now. I said, I live here now.
I live here now. What do you mean I cannot? Of course I can. I
course
am
I can.
living here.
Laws? No. Okay, one more panel.
Come on, you can do that.
Home stretch and then live it up.
And champagne.
Champagne in the streets. You can go right now.
Raspberry pi. Oh my goodness.
You can go right now.
Just jealous. Bring me some.
I will support you going, honestly. You can. I'm sure this is the panel where I ruin it all, so it'll be better if you're not here for that. I'm due for, yeah, you will. You'll see the start of some kind of international war.
If anything goes wrong, just tweet at the Chinese social media then.
Just censor it?
No, don't censor. Just send a whole bunch of tweets about like positive things. And
Yes.
drown the rest.
Yeah, make
They don't
a fake
censor.
accounts and
Yeah.
like.
Don't bother
He
with
didn't say that.
censoring
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't engage with whatever you don't like. Don't let it be visible. Just a whole bunch of things.
I'll make companies afraid of me.
Yeah.
I'll make.
Did you learn anything from that?
I know. I should be learning from this week. This is the playbook. This is the playbook.
Yeah.
It's almost finished.
I like panels so much more. Like, now people are gonna listen. You're not talking.
Yeah. Well,
Like,
at least no one can upstage you.
Yeah, well, no one can.
Oh, yeah. That's a good point. I forgot about that. You don't have to. I mean, I tweeted. Are you on Twitter? Do I follow you on Twitter?
Are you?
Let's find out. Let's do it right now.
There we go.
That's here?
You're not following me. Yes.
You're not following me.
Well, sorry.
Goes both ways. But it's fine now. Cool. Boston and Istanbul. Oh, I think it's. Yeah. I think so. Okay. Hey folks, welcome back to MozFest 2019. Can we get a round of applause for all the folks who have been, this is a round of applause. This is like, you guys are asleep right now? Thank you. So next up, we have a talk from Jansu Janja. She was one of the panelists yesterday. She is the founder and director of the AI Ethics Lab, and she also has a PhD in philosophy. So I'd like to bring up Jansu right now. Give her a round of applause. Enjoy.
Thanks. So I will be talking about ethical AI, which, oops, too quickly, which is something that we are talking about so much recently that it seems like we've been talking about it for ages. That's not really the case. For the longest time, ethics of AI or AI ethics has been only something that is of interest of a handful of philosophers, computer scientists, and sci-fi authors, basically. Only recently, the public started caring about it, and I can be even more specific. So this is the worldwide Google search trends for the past 5 years of the term AI ethics. You can try different versions, you know, ethical AI, ethics in AI, and you will get more or less the same trend. Basically, until 2016, when you said AI ethics, you would just get like blank stares. People wouldn't know what you're talking about. Then things started changing in late 2017. And that is when we started having scandals. And these are just a few of the major scandals. There is a whole larger map out there if you search for it. And the thing is, these scandals started bringing home the message that technology and AI is not free from ethics. It's not ethics neutral. On the contrary, all of these ethical problems are really woven into the phases of building an AI system. So from the research to design, development, deployment, updating, marketing, all of them have different ethical questions. And some of these ethical scandals are about social media and its effects on politics, democracy. Some of them are about premature collaborations between companies, tech companies, and militaries and law enforcement. And some about safety and security and privacy, and how AI systems categorize us into, you know, who gets to get the job, who gets the loan, financial loan, and who gets to the jail. And I mean, if you realize this is a problem for all of us. So even if you are a developer or you are a lead at the tech company, it's still, you're not just the creator of AI systems. You're always also subject to AI systems, other AI systems that you're not creating. So even if you are building them, you are always being categorized by the systems that others are building. So we have to have some sort of solution to these problems. And the solution has been coming in the form of, so this is another timeline that sort of matches the last one that I showed. Basically, 3 types of solutions have been proposed. One is early stage regulations in AI ethics. The other one is AI boards. So many companies are now building AI ethics boards. And the other one is AI principles, whole bunch of AI principles. So we have right now a little over 80 sets of AI principles coming from private companies, institutions, international organizations, governmental agencies. And all of these efforts, we can sort of categorize them into two approaches. So one is enforcing ethics. How do we enforce ethics? And the other one is integrating ethics. To enforce ethics, we need external regulations. So there is a very important function of the regulations and laws, which is to make sure that we at least have the boundaries of what is ethically acceptable and not acceptable. So this is also very important because if you want certain companies or certain developers to care about ethics, you also want to make sure that you don't force them to compete with those who don't care. You want to make sure at least there is some sort of fair playing field. But the problem with the regulations is that they can never be very detailed. So they are not going to answer your everyday ethics questions. They are just going to be general guidelines. And when you think about, if you take an example of how the ethical questions arise while you're developing an AI system, you really realize that, yes, there's a very important function of regulations, but it's just not enough. So think about, for example, developing a personalized AI or personalized system for advice in healthy living. So it's sort of like an AI health coach. There will be, as you are developing something like this, and this is an example, by the way, that was brought to us so that we work on the ethical issues of this. So it's not a hypothetical, completely speaking. So there will be many ethically loaded questions. So what data are you gonna, so think about it like a variable. It's gonna basically understand your health and will give you the right health advice, healthy living advice. So there will be many questions that you have to answer as you're building this, many ethically loaded questions. What data are you going to collect? Are you going to only track the user's physical data, like a Fitbit? Or are you going to log into their Instagram? Are you going to have access to their Instagram to check their mood? How much do they party? Are you going to log into their Alexa to see whether they have a peaceful home environment or not? They would be very useful information for healthy living, for your advice, but are these ethical options? Who do you share this data with, whatever you are collecting? And how do you design a consent form for the user to understand what they are sharing, with whom they are sharing, and what are they getting out of it? What are they receiving in return? And of course, other connected questions to these, right? Like, are there safeguards for insurance companies not to later punish the user for not taking the advice from the AI health coach? So there are also connected questions within the domain you're operating in. If it is healthcare, you will have all the healthcare-related questions that's there. So these are complex questions, and these are not questions that just simple regulations, well, simple, just regulations, general regulations, even if they are not simple, can address. And they are internal questions. So like, it shouldn't be answered by external bodies, but they should be answered internally. And we do seem to have going to that direction of this internal integration of ethics into the process for building AI systems by these AI principles that are proposed by the companies and the AI ethics boards within the companies. So this is actually an oversight and compliance model, the principles and the boards. And we have this model for the last 40 years from research ethics. So this is not a new model at all. You have the research ethics boards. Those of you who are doing research in academia, you are familiar with it. Institutional review boards, IRBs, or research ethics committees in the Europe, RECs. And they use principles to evaluate research. And they are still trying to apply these general principles. There are just 4 principles, actually, that they are trying to apply. And the problem with this approach is that if you realize it's still not really integrating. It's within the company, but it is still a board that is sitting distant from the developers or the project teams, and that has this also at like a hierarchical level that approves your research or does not approve your research. So it's not exactly integration we are talking about. And also, most of the time, these boards either don't have the right expertise, both for the science of whatever you're doing and the ethics of whatever you're doing, and they certainly don't have enough time, even if they have the expertise, because if you imagine all these questions being posed by every single project team, we are talking about a lot of questions. So we are, in one sense, we are still talking about enforcement of ethics with these boards and principles. It's just a different level of enforcement. It doesn't come from the regulatory level, like the external level. It's within the company, but it's still enforcing ethics. And it seems to, this whole enforcing ethics, while it's important, while it's important if it's crafted well, let's put it that way, seems to miss the main question, which is how do you solve ethical problems as you are developing AI systems? So, in other words, how should we really integrate ethics into building and developing AI systems? Not enforcing, but integrating it. So before I get to that, though, I think I should talk about why should we care about this. Because, so I'm a philosopher, as Javier said, and we have a very large literature. We are not fooling ourselves. We have a very large literature about how ethical reasoning is great, but it doesn't motivate people to do the right thing. So I'm going to try to give you a couple more motivations. If you're already motivated because it's the right thing, that's great. But if you're not, as a company or as a developer, as the practitioners basically, when you're not endorsing ethics, basically you are taking a risk. And it's quite a high-stake risk, because what you're doing is that every time something goes wrong, every time there's a scandal, basically you are giving the impression that you are the wild ones that the society has to control, which means heavy regulations are going to come to your way, and which also means if the scandals keep coming, they're going to come really fast. So these regulations will not even be good regulations, which is terrible for everyone because it's bad for the businesses, there won't be enough space for innovation, and it's bad for the society because innovation helps things. As long as the innovation is responsible, it's a good thing. We want to have the innovation going on. So this is at least one more reason why you should care. So then how do we integrate ethics? So if we want to solve ethical questions, then we have to think of them not just like policing ethics, but we need to think of them as like puzzle solving. Of course, ethical questions are not this simple, so they are like this. There's like very complex moving parts at all times that you have to deal with about individual well-being, individual autonomy, societal well-being, social justice, harm, but you have to consider them. And you have to consider them at each stage, as I said, from the beginning. Research, development, design, deployment, updating, all of these have unique ethical questions. So what's the model? One thing that we need to do is to catch these ethical problems from the very beginning, as soon as we can, before they become bigger problems. And if possible, just eliminate them. And for that, we need the people who are actually building AI systems, the developers and the researchers, to be aware of the relevant ethical issues and to have some sort of tool to deal with these ethical issues. So if these questions are not very complex, then we can do that by training the developers and the researchers, basically add another tool for their toolbox to deal with these ethical issues. By deal with them, I mean either, if it is, as I said, simple, solve them. If not, flag them. Just flag them and demand solutions for them. The second aspect is when the question is really complex. Obviously, we don't want to spend all the energy of people whose task is to build these tools to dive into the deep philosophical literature. But there is a deep philosophical literature, and applied ethics has been around for a very long time. So we have a lot of knowledge around applied ethics and using ethical problem solving in practice. We've been using it in medicine, in public health, in environmental questions. In businesses, we've been using applied ethics, so it's not like we are not reinventing the wheel here. So what you can do is to analyze the project. If it is a complex project, then you analyze the domain. If it is in healthcare, again, think about the AI health coaches that I just mentioned. Well, you have to understand the ethical questions around healthcare system, and you have to understand the questions around variables, the technology itself. And you need to figure out a set of right answers. Yes, a lot of the times, there is no single right answer. When the question is complex enough, we won't have a single right answer, but we can eliminate it to a couple of right answers. And that, if you could just choose from that set of right answers, you're really, really good. We are so much better off. And finally, certain complex questions will keep appearing over and over again. And for that, we don't want to rediscover the whole thing again. We don't want to do analysis again from the very beginning. What we want to do is slowly set a strategy for the company or the institution. So basically, figure out, those 80 sets of principles. Well, figure out what they really want to say. What do these companies want to say with those principles? A lot of the times, principles will say things that are very charming, like be socially beneficial and protect individual autonomy and privacy, and you will realize that, well, they clash a lot of the times. That's what a complex ethical question is. They clash. So how are you going to deal with them? As a company, what is your agenda? What is your strategy? Ethical strategy. And so operationalizing these principles, putting processes around them, and setting precedents. what did you decide last time you had a similar question? And how are you going to use that knowledge now with this next question on the table? So these 3 steps, where are we actually doing this? Where can we do these? Well, obviously in the companies. So any company that has some resources to devote to ethical analyses can look into these, integrating these into their into the processes in building AI systems. The other one is incubators and accelerators. Startups are usually quite concerned about the ethical aspects of the products that they are building, but they don't have the resources, and that's very understandable. So the incubators that they are located in and the accelerators that they are located in are the right places where these services, these information can be offered them. And finally, the research centers. So academic institutions are as lost as the private companies. So you still need these steps to be integrated into the research and development process within the academic centers, within the research institutions. And the demand for this should come from companies and startups who understand that, well, hopefully who understand that ethics matters, but if not, that business risk matters. Developers who care about really just developing good technology, because when your technology is making huge ethical mistakes, usually they're also wrong. If you're trying to have the best algorithm for hiring decisions, and you, because of biases, you discard a whole bunch of women, your algorithm is actually not getting the right people. So it is an enhancement of the technology if you get the ethics right. And as developers, my sense is we care about this. And investors who are investing into these companies, because they are also taking a risk, business risk. So basically, what we need to be doing is moving from this, this model of ethics as policing, which puts off a lot of the practitioners, as well as, trust me, a lot of the philosophers, but really go into puzzle solving, and to do that using the knowledge that comes from ethics together with the knowledge that comes from AI, and hence the AI ethics. That's all. Thank you.
All right, so now, all right, now we'll take 3 questions from the audience. If there's anyone who wants to ask a question, Jansu, now is your time. We have one over here. Sorry, 1 second. Behind.
Over there.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So you talked about startups and how they can, the incubators are a great place for them to access information about ethics and how to integrate it. I've worked with quite a lot of startup founders who want to, they've spotted a gap, or they've seen something that can be fixed, and often there's an ethical reason for that. Mm-hmm. But what happens when investment starts coming in? So I think in my experience, it often becomes more difficult for startup founders to kind of keep hold of that those original values once investment comes in.
Yeah. Basically, you're right, and what you're pointing to is that as soon as there are parties involved that don't care about the ethics of whatever you're doing, there is a tension, and then you have to make the decision, well, I really want to get this startup going, should I just this once not do this? The good thing is that the investors care more and more, in my experience. This was, again, an absolutely not talked about topic just 2 years ago when you talk to investors, and now they do care a lot of the times, especially when investing into the startups, because they don't yet have the commitment, right? Like, they can now think about it. And hopefully getting them care is how you can, and if it is not, you're really looking at the ethics versus the market pull, which is the problem, but it is also, as the culture is slowly changing, it is also a problem that there is hope that it can align somehow.
We have a question back there. Mm-hmm. We have a mic coming around right now.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Fanny. Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to ask you to give me one example to apply all that model and your presentation to an ethical problem. And if you could tell me a little bit about how to distinguish your solution with ethics as opposed to a legal solution to that problem. Thank you.
Sure. So I can give you the example that I just gave so to keep it short, that I gave in the talk. Building AI health coaches. The questions are, so legally speaking, consent form for AI, something like that, is very non-functional, dysfunctional. You basically have terms of services, you scroll through, you accept everyone knows you're not reading it, and it's not a big legal issue. There is a debate, but there is no enforcement of it. It is an ethical issue, and we are all aware of that. So one way that it diverges is, like, ethically speaking, terms and conditions mean absolutely nothing if we know that you're not reading it. Because what it should mean is informed consent. You know, there is a reason why we call it informed consent, and there is no information provided. The information is not provided in the way that a person will have the time to read, will have the energy to read, and it's updated all the time. So everything around that, for example, is a major ethical problem. It's not yet a legal problem. The good thing about ethics and legal to often aligning is that when the conversation starts somewhere, usually in ethics, that informs the rules, regulations, luckily, so that they start there is a good feedback loop between the two. Something that you kept saying as again, going back to another field, just medical healthcare, something that was a problem, the informed consent, just ethically speaking, became a legal rule. You have to have this implemented and implemented properly at this point. So I would say this is one like really simple example where it changes. And how it would happen, well, you know, the whole consent structure around this particular product has to be designed while you're designing before you basically push it out.
We have time for one more question in case there was somebody who wants to. We have one question right here. There's a mic right behind you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I think the integration point is a really, really powerful one. And I'm curious if you've seen examples of this, especially and ones that are really functional, because from what I've observed, engineers by training don't have necessarily all of the domain knowledge necessary to do that puzzle solving.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, and so how do you bring the other relevant experts to the table? And have you seen that working, and how did that come to be? Because it doesn't seem to me to be the way that most tech companies are structured today.
You're absolutely right. Basically, everything right now is still in the experimental phase. So we went from like zero concern to real concern, and now there is experimenting. Like all the companies are experimenting with different models of integration. And as I said, the compliance and oversight model is sort of taking hold of the situation, but companies are also doing seminars and trainings. They are having boards that are more functional. By the way, I think, yes, very important point you make is that, no, I don't expect engineers to now ditch engineering, go into philosophy, solve all the ethical problems, because, I mean, there's a division of labor, right? So philosophers are the ones who deal with the ethical questions. And if you need like a field information, well, sociology people should be the ones that you should go for. So we have the right training already, and we have these trainings come together in different fields where we decided to care about ethics already. So again, I talk about the healthcare example a lot because healthcare is an area where we managed to get ethics really integrated. Not perfect, but the best that we have. And there you do have philosophers collaborate with public health people to decide, how to set the guidelines, how to set the agendas. And in particular cases, with a hospital, what are you going to do about this particular case? You don't tell the surgeon, okay, now take 3 days off, figure everything out yourself. No, because that would be a waste of the surgeon's time in this particular question, whereas you have people who are actually skilled in this.
Nice. All right, well, that's it. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for the great talk. See you soon. You can give us All right, next up is the Future of Digital Policy in Europe panel. I'll be joined by 3 panelists soon. The panelists here? Oh, here they are. All right, give a big hand for Katarzyna, Guillermo, and Prabhat. There they are. Do you guys need help? Okay. Hey. All right, so a little bit of introductions. I'll start ladies first. Katarzyna Szemyelewicz, co-founder and president of the Panopticon Foundation, lawyer and activist specializing in human rights and technology, and you might have recognized her from the talk she was part of yesterday, and Kasha for short, right? Okay, that's cool. Prabhat Agarwal. Prabhat's been with the European Commission for the last 12 years, now doing online platforms and e-commerce. He's a policymaker at the EU Commission dealing with regulating platforms. And you have a tech background. You studied physics, computer science, et cetera, et cetera. It's like a long resume. And then we have Guillermo Beltra. Guillermo is a global policy director at Access Now, a global NGO working to defend human rights for users at risk. So thank you for joining me today. I want to talk about digital policy in Europe, but just to kind of level set and start, GDPR went into effect about a year and a half ago. What do you think we've learned since? Which parts are working and which parts are not working? Anyone can start. Yeah, Prabhat, you wanted to?
So I think, I don't want to go into the details of kind of which part, because it's a huge piece of law, and let me just zoom out on kind of a couple of things, what work and what don't work. You know, of course, I get annoyed, like many people, clicking away my cookie consent forms, but I think that kind of distracts from the real issue. I think that what's really impressive is that I think GDPR has really been a game changer in kind of how we see tech policy and tech regulation, you know, taking an issue which is a fundamental rights issue, you know, and putting a frame around it. And what I think has been really surprising is that I've been kind of part of this from the beginning, but from a slight distance, because this is a data protection issue dealt with by another team. But the way that we've turned 180 degrees from something that was completely crazy, completely impossible, it would never work, it would destroy the internet, to something where a lot of people say, wow, you know, this is like a really powerful framework for protecting user rights, and you know, lots of people are saying we want to now copy this, at least in part, you know, around the world, and I think that's been really a learning experience that has informed some of my thinking. Okay, so you know, some of the things that are still kind of settling in right now, you know, because it's relatively recent, so it's a lot of emphasis now is shifting away from the actual meaning of the rules and how they apply now to enforcing those. You know, like, so we see cases being geared up by data protection authorities in member states. We see the global conversation around data protection and privacy changing. So those are really the game-changing positive elements. I think some of the negative elements that I think people are annoyed about is the kind of banner clicking, but let's not forget that there is also e-privacy regulation that is still being negotiated, and I'm still hoping that it'll be adopted soon. That'll at least in part solve some of the issues, you know. But in general, people are much more aware of privacy issues around the internet than just even a couple of years ago. People are taking it much more seriously. It's conversation in schools, it's conversation not only in some offices in Brussels, but it's conversations worldwide. I think that's really my takeaway from what has happened.
Nice.
Yeah. No, I think I agree. Politically, it's a success in the sense that it has sparked this global conversation about the importance of privacy and data protection. We've seen a 10% increase in countries that have actually adopted new data protection frameworks that are completed. And there's like 30 other countries around the world that are now working on their new data protection frameworks. So I was thinking, so I agree the main objective of the GDPR is to put some legal structure on the protection of a fundamental right in Europe. And it's important to remember that it's everything that's in GDPR is not new. Actually, not many things are new. It's just bringing an old data protection law into kind of more the modern area and putting some obligations and some enforcement measures on top of it. But I was thinking earlier in the panel you guys had on governing AI about how do you regulate the market? Like, how do you tell the market where a market, in that case it was AI, but here it's like more the digital space, where do you want it to go? And that, I think, is that the GDPR is a good public policy tool, because in addition to protecting a fundamental right, you're telling the market, that's the direction I want you guys to innovate towards and to think towards. And in that sense, it is being a success. All that said, like Prabhat just said, it's way too soon. It only entered into force about a year and a half ago. There's still Slovenia and Greece have not developed their own implementing laws nationally. Data protection authorities are way far from having sufficient resources to go police everything that they have to go police. So we're happy where things are going, but there's a lot of work to be done still.
Yeah, did you want to weigh in as well?
I fully agree. It's a bit too early. I think we need at least 3 more years to see the enforcement measures at full speed. What was the biggest victory in GDPR is that the old rules existing for 2 decades, got extended globally because they finally are used successfully against global companies who target European citizens with their services, and that wasn't the case before. And B, we have money is in place. Huge financial fines are in place, and that's the conversation starter or a door opener for the EU to start negotiating the standards really. But where it gets difficult is this moment where we realize that GDPR is proposing very sound rules for old business models that are in fundamental conflict with these rules. So if you think about cookies or pop-ups, I mean, we cannot imagine the amount of pop-ups necessary to fulfill the need to inform people about what's going on with their data behind the screen. That's not the solution. We have to remove the data. We have to end the data transfers happening behind the screen rather than try to clean them or legalize them with pop-ups or any measures of that sort. And this is where it gets difficult, because at some point, enforcement of GDPR will have to mean that we cancel some of the business models. We simply delegalize them, like the whole ad tech business model. The advertising technology developed in a way that cannot be reconciled with GDPR. No pop-up will clean it. So we have to face it. And that's the difficult part, because even for data protection authorities today, it is a bit hard to say, okay, that branch of the industry has to disappear because it's not in line with our principles. That's the hard bit.
Yeah, I'm glad you and Prabhat brought up the cookie pop. This is a hot button issue backstage when we were talking about when you go to a website, hey, we are asking to save cookies on your computer. Is that okay? I feel like I get that pop-up still 50 times a day. But Guillermo, when I mentioned that, you said don't blame the sites for that pop-up. Like, who's at blame for that annoyance? Or is that even a bad thing?
Or the law. Like, what's important to recognize is that nobody's forcing those advertising networks to do those complex cookie pop-ups or consent notices via email that way at all. And to Kasia's point, nobody's forcing them to have that business model where it's all based on tracking every single one of us, every single click we do around the web. So the whole point is, how do we nudge the market out of that business model, fully agreed, into one that is much more privacy friendly, but also remember that the GDPR is not the only legislative tool that Europe has in the equation. Prabhat has just mentioned the e-privacy regulation. This goes hand in hand with the GDPR, and it's not complete yet. And it's there where the EU is trying to give some rules out there to users and to market actors about how to deal with, for example, browser settings and kind of the settings on the devices on what companies can and cannot do with our own personal data and with our devices. And unfortunately, that legislative file is stuck.
Did you want to?
Yeah, maybe just a side comment. I think that, one thing is kind of to focus on the kind of friction and the annoyance, and the other thing is to kind of turn it around a little bit and say that actually, that bit of friction is making apparent, it's surfacing something that has been kind of been hiding, and so, it feels a little bit like kind of, there's a kind of bump under the carpet, and before you couldn't really feel the bump, right? And now you kind of say, hey, there's a funny bump under the carpet. What's going on? And you kind of look under the carpet, and you see all these this whole tracking business that's going on, right? And so of course the bump is uncomfortable, and it'd be much nicer if the bump went there, but actually it's worth looking under the carpet and to see what's going on there, and I think that so we would, we have regulated and made proposals for making the bump a bit more smoother. It's just what Guillermo said, and let's see what the future of that file holds. But I think besides ironing out the bump, let's take a look under the carpet, and let's have a look at what's actually going on there, and that's something that we'll be focusing on in the next couple of months and years to come, to shine a light a little bit on exactly a very complex kind of industry and a kind of complex service, which is, I think it's. I'm not really, I'm agnostic at this particular point whether it's something that, like Kasia said, we need to kind of be tough on that. But, I'm also conscious that actually some of this is cross-financing free services, and there's a huge expectation of consumers to kind of consume content for free on the web. So our first step is going to be just to take a look, like and take a look with an open mind at a very complex area. What we do know, though, from some behavioral research that we've been doing and commissioning, is that when you talk to users, the first time you talk to users and you say, hey, what do you think about targeting? What do you think about recommender systems and so on? The first time they say, hey, this is really good stuff, like I get what I want, And then you iterate and you explain, hey, do you know how they get to know how to target you? And I said, I didn't know. And then the second iteration, they say, maybe it's not such a great idea. If you iterate once more, people can swing their views on whether they like what's going on quite a lot. I think that process of discussion is really something that we need to have now again.
System is that people are on one hand observed constantly beyond their awareness, on the other they are constantly targeted. So that's a deeply unfair setting. In a way, we have to rebuild it, and that's why I'm saying that some business models will have to go away, because they're fundamentally they cannot be aligned with the principles of trust, transparency, choice that we built in the European law. It's like with ecology, we can discuss how to deal with waste and how to recycle, but wouldn't it be better to produce less waste or remove?
Just two quick thoughts actually on all of this. One is, first of all, it's very encouraging to hear that an important regulator that like the European Commission is now willing to lift up the carpet and look underneath it, because many groups like ours, we've been kind of sounding that alarm bell for 10, 15 years.
I'm liking this carpet metaphor. This is great.
There was an ongoing global conversation about this whole do not track standard, and when that failed, we, at least in Europe, were saying, well, then we got to find at least a European solution, because online tracking cannot become just the main business model everywhere, and it has, and it's bigger and bigger. So how to keep that under control? So it's great that the European Commission now has that approach, but also the GDPR has important principles. So I'm coming back to the question on enforcement as well. We have a lot of rules, but not a lot of resources and time yet to actually go enforce them. So for example, privacy by design and by default are two very important principles that I bet you anything all these ad networks are not complying with if it came to a court to have to rule on that. So there are already tools that we have to start using to iron out that carpet and get all those business models that are not compatible with fundamental rights out the door.
Yeah, this may be wrong, but sometimes it feels like. Take that one.
I mean, I take European perspective. I'm looking at what FTC does and what what US-based politicians like Elizabeth Warren say from European perspective. So I actually see quite radical headlines coming from the US. I also remember, I think 2 years ago, US-based researchers and advocates coming to CPDP, our annual Brussels-based conference on privacy, with this "Break Them Up" banner. And I thought, like, wow, welcome, guys. Like, finally somebody's saying this really forceful measures like financial fines for quite a while against these companies, and I believe they already got to the wall, to the point where they see that structural measures like breaking them up are necessary, because financial fines clearly don't work. So maybe they haven't came up with privacy protective regulation yet, it's only now happening, but before us they started using pro-competition measures against these big platforms because they had them at home, and maybe they were the first to see targeting risks or manipulation of public debate risks, because they had a lot of this business going on before we saw it at full scale in Europe with say, Brexit campaign. So I wouldn't be that critical. I think a lot of ideas are coming from the other side of the.
Well, first of all, this is what I meant earlier. You know, the conversation, the global conversation around regulating tech has, of course, changed. You know, that's part. So part of it is like a general techlash kind of phenomenon. The other one is that that you know, people are looking all over the world about, you know, kind of similar issues. You know, whether it's data protection or content moderation, or you know, like what happened after the Christchurch incident was a kind of example where kind of governments are saying, hey, what are you going to do about it? Kind of just watch this happening. I just want a warning, and maybe that's a bit weird from the European Commission to say that, but you know, the quantity of regulation is not necessarily a good indicator, you know, of success. You know, it's you know, we see the Russian internet law is about to come in force on the 1st of November. You know, and we really have quite serious concerns about that. You know, so it's not just whether you are regulating the net and how many laws you've got there. You know, it's really about finding you know, a good operable framework that gives market participants clarity, that protects fundamental rights and users' rights, you know, and that meets kind of legitimate, well-specified policy aims, and that's really kind of what we should be looking at, you know, not really the amount of regulation. There's no shortage of appetite, particularly in less free countries, to regulate the internet. You know, so let's not forget that. You know, like this should not be the only yardstick that we that we apply. You know, what the yardstick we should be applying is: are we solving a real problem? Do we have evidence of the nature, the scale, and the depth of the problem? Are we taking the least invasive option, which is still effective? You know, to address these problems. This is the standard to which the Commission should hold itself. And we do, and then the democratic process should challenge that, right? And but it's really important not to just say, is there enough regulation or not? Because that puts us in a binary of whether we regulate or not. That's the wrong framing. The wrong framing is what's the problem exactly, and how we're going to solve it.
Got it. And Guillermo?
Yeah, and well, first of all, also to say, like I agree, just regulation for the sake of regulation is not what we're talking about. And if I may, Europe doesn't do everything right either. So we're not, like as a civil society, I think we're not happy with every internet-related regulation that has come out of the EU. Look at the copyright directive or what might happen with the terrorist content directive, so on. But for me, the point is that there are many conversations around the world, in Latin America, in the US, in India, in so many different fora as well, about how do we deal with these complex multidimensional internet problems, and the solution will not always be through EU-style regulation. And that may be fine as long as we are solving problems as long as we're finding solutions. Remember is that the GDPR is not just, now that we're zooming into the GDPR, it's not just a protective sphere for Europeans or for people in Europe. It's actually, if you read the title of the GDPR, the second part of it is until data flows around the world or something like this. And that's something that we need the European Commission as well to, through those negotiations it has with other countries, so that the personal data can flow in both directions, uphold, kind of help elevate the level of data protection around the world.
Yeah, I want to go, that's a really good point, but I want to go back to what Prabhat was saying about, what I got from that was essentially quantity is not important, like the quality of the laws being passed is more important. And this is a question I asked in the previous panel, but whenever I see Facebook and Google being fined billions and looking at how much they make just in a quarter, which is multiple billions, like if we're talking about future of policy for these internet companies, how do you go about reprimanding or putting in effective laws when money is no object? How do you do that?
Well, it's a good question. So the treaty says that sanctions should be dissuasive, proportionate, and effective. You know, and we're asking ourselves, what does that mean now? You know, if the stock price goes up after you hit a company with a $5 billion dollar fine, you know, is that dissuasive? You know, is that effective? And is it proportionate? You know, so. That's a really good question. You know, like ultimately though. The fine is a means to an end. The end is the behavior change. You know, that you to the rules. You know, like so it's certainly something we're going to take into account. And you know, the Commission on Antitrust has fined Google on numerous occasions. You know, like in some cases, you know, there have been commitments which we're monitoring and to see whether they're really living up. So it's not just about the fine. So there's also a follow-up on that. But you're right. I mean, I think we are entering into a space where we're asking ourselves, you know, what does dissuasive really look like, you know, and that's a really important question, you know, and a lot of people are asking that question in terms of kind of, and they're framing it. I'm not necessarily framing it like this, but it is being framed as a matter of sovereignty, rule of law, kind of, you know, who's the boss? Yeah, you know, like it's not necessarily how I view it. But this is this is part of the conversation out there, you know, and so I don't have a good answer of what the alternative is, but it's certainly something we're going to look at.
I have a suggestion. I think there are at least 3 approaches, and 2 of them we already tried. First is taxing them, because that's effectively what the fines are. It's just another tax imposed on these companies, and they're clearly ready to pay that tax because they became wealthy enough to do it, and that's not going to be effective. But, well, I mean, transferring money from their budgets to public budgets makes sense. I'm not saying stop fining them. Yes, please continue, but remember that there are 2 other approaches possible. Second is what I call constitution for digital emperors. We can approach these digital emperors and kindly ask them to be more protective of our principles, our rights. So ask Facebook to observe due process when it's removing content, or maybe reveal more information about targeting, political ads, all other types of content. You know, we've been discussing this for a decade, I believe. We had some progress. GDPR also can be seen as this constitution for the emperor to some extent. I believe Digital Services Act, another initiative coming from Brussels, which I welcome very much, could be such a constitution, but that's still not taking the power away from these emperors, and that would be the third approach, which is structural measures, but not case by case, having FTC or European Commission busy investigating, multiple markets, different companies, but maybe having some new data that I advocate for, also in my previous talk in this space, and I think that's the biggest challenge. Of course, we know we won't come up with it next month, but maybe next 5 years is the time frame in which we could redevelop our thinking about this data ecosystem and propose simply new structure, move the power a bit around the field.
Yeah, that emperor-empire metaphor is so strong. I want to go back to, go ahead.
Can I just add, learning from past mistakes is also very important. So a very recent one is allowing the merger between Facebook and WhatsApp. I think that it's now evident that we've just allowed that giant to become so big that it has created that it now controls effectively the largest communication platform in the world, and regulating it and keeping under control all the problems that stem from that has become so complex because of that. And in hindsight, at least from a European context, the European Commission was in a good place. Wait a second, this is probably going to create way more problems than benefits. The question is whether competition rules and the policies that help the Commission make those decisions are up and kind of ready for the digital age. And that's another question that we need to be asking. How can we rethink all those frameworks and all those enforcer authorities to be able to deal with such new complex phenomena?
Yeah. We don't, so the panelists told me that they want to forfeit some of their time to hear some of your questions, so I'll only keep it at 2 more questions, and then you guys can hear from them, the audience. But going back to what you said before about how GDPR, a big part of it is like data flow freely around the world, and global is the first word in GDPR. I want to talk to you about global, not just regional, but also being all-inclusive. Like, it's only lawmakers generally who kind of have a influence over the laws that get passed.
Yeah, that's an interesting conversation we were having backstage as well. In the context of, first of all, and we had a very interesting conversation about what is our understanding of the open internet globally, like what does open mean? And there is such a multiple fora, both regulatory and self-regulatory, and just conversations around the world, that it's not very easy to just pinpoint one place where you can say, okay, there is where you really need a kind of a multi-stakeholder approach, because on some you have it, on some you don't. So right now, just the complexity of the global conversation about all these issues is pretty unmanageable. What we were talking about just earlier is that when you have conversations about human rights, it is for us. It is very important, and that's a lot of what we do globally, to bring in groups that are the most affected to the conversation, the most marginalized and vulnerable groups that see themselves most affected when there is content about issues that they care of being taken down, or when they are suffering a lot of just on attacks to who they are or to what they're doing and so on. And having those voices in those conversations is just key at any level.
Yeah. And then last question I want to ask everybody on stage before I open up to the audience is just like, what does a win look like? Like, what should we aim for here? And don't all rush at once.
It's a hard one, right? I don't think we can have final answer today because that's a process. That's something that I believe should be the task for the whole movement of people in MozFest and beyond MozFest, because it is a real task that we have to, work on together. Nobody should have the arrogance to say that's the win for everybody. But definitely what's not the win is the current situation when we have big dominant players in the middle of the ecosystem controlling data flows, controlling what is allowed, what is not allowed, guessing the needs of all these vulnerable people, ruling them basically in quite authoritarian way. That's what we want to depart from. So on the other side of that spectrum, I can see open ecosystem in which, for example, vulnerable groups can organize themselves bottom up and define what it means for them to be safe or what it means for them to express themselves, and then the ecosystem basically including this, allowing for that diversity. So a diverse, federated, open ecosystem, which is not ruled by any benevolent emperor, but basically much more bottom-up and preserved with rules like GDPR, like hopefully new regulations providing for privacy and security.
How about you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think I could have said it better. That's the whole concept. We have to protect the internet as the public resource that it is to enable communities, individuals, and also companies to thrive in a way in which it empowers and expands fundamental rights and innovation and so on, and not the contrary. And we've been having this, I've been like in multiple circles having similar conversations throughout these past days, and I've heard some ask, are we having a nostalgic vision of the internet? Is it that what it used to be and we just have to change mindset? I would say no. That's still, that for me is still the idea. It's just the dynamics might be different. The technology is definitely different. Now, things like, for example, the advent of AI and so on complicate the whole conversation even much more and so on. But the idea of having this public resource that helps society work better and integrate better amongst themselves and be more open is definitely what we should strive for.
Prabhat?
I think, from my perspective, I think there are kind of three elements of a win. One is that users feel kind of safe and empowered online, but also free. And where that balance lies is going to be our challenge in the next kind of couple of months. But I think that on those two aspects, users being safe, empowered, and free, I think the balance isn't quite right at the moment. It's part of the abuse problem that we mentioned. It's maybe the ad tracking problem that Kasia mentioned. That's one thing. There's a third element which we didn't really discuss, which from the EU perspective is super important, is that to continue to make sure that the EU is a great place to start, kind of innovative service. And just maybe I'll end on this anecdote. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Riga. There's a great startup, students setting up a kind of house sharing platform when they move into university. It's great stuff, and they wanted to expand to Amsterdam and Berlin, and the guys just looked at me. Are there any EU laws that I should be aware of? And I just said no, don't worry. But so it was. But it needs to be. We need to make sure that we also keep these people in mind. We focus on Facebook and Google and the big ones, but there are like 10,000 small startups in Europe, all trying to kind of grow here at home, and they need to make sure. We need to also make rules that work for these people. So a win for me is a situation in which users are safe, empowered, and free online, and where small startups feel that Europe is a good place to start a business.
I just want to add one more on
Sure.
the big ones. One for me would also be if the knowledge generated about humankind, all of us, by the big ones, can serve the smaller ones and can serve the public purpose. Let's not forget that there is also a lot of knowledge or value generated by the existing ecosystem, the closed existing ecosystem, that is now controlled for commercial reasons, but we don't want to destroy it, right? We want to, I hope, reuse it for a better. So that's also a target.
Nice. All right, now audience question and answer. Anybody have any questions? I've got a few in the middle, one in the back. Kevin's coming around with a microphone right now.
Hi, thanks for the panel. It was really interesting. I just wanted to pick up on the point about competition law, which I think Guillermo mentioned, and how does that need to evolve in the EU and beyond? Because consumers are giving their data away for free. They're not exchanging money with these companies. So how do you measure detriment when it's not someone losing money and there might not be a choice to switch to a different service provider?
Should I take this?
Sure, you can take it.
So that's a really good question. So in my team and in also DG competition of the European Commission, like the antitrust team, we are in an ongoing conversation about exactly that, what you've just said. And I think you might have seen that there are a couple of reports that have been, just have been published this year around the future of competition law and in this space. And I think that what we're doing right now, and it's going to take a little bit of time, but digesting all the recommendations that have been made at EU level, in Germany, in the UK, in the US, also in Australia, and we're kind of processing this at the moment to distill which elements of recommendations will go through a kind of review of competition rules and to what extent are they necessary. But we're also looking at, in this area, if there's any need for additional ex-ante regulations, to help that. But the point that you're making, that the kind of consumer welfare standard is something to kind of double check, is that really the right standard? That's certainly something we're looking at very closely. So we have a pretty good team of people looking at it. It's the same team that was responsible for the antitrust enforcement for Google. And I think there's a willingness to kind of take a fresh look at this. And Executive Vice President Vestager has also announced that we would be looking at that and as a follow-up. How exactly it would look like, I think there are some ideas in the table. We're just kind of going through exactly what has been proposed. And it's not going to be a quick win, but it's certainly something we're taking very seriously. So point fully taken, and there's at least 2 full working teams on this to follow it up in the Commission.
Great. Any other questions out in the audience? We had a couple over here. Actually, there's a few. Is Kevin still going around?
I'm Jesse McCroskey, a data scientist with Mozilla, and thanks for the thoughtful discussion. I was curious that given that many problematic uses of data online use the example of the ad tech industry, which I think is great, can really constitute human experimentation, do you think that the existing frameworks around ethical approval for human experimentation could be a useful tool here?
I believe you refer to framework for research, right? Yeah, that's a brilliant idea, and I think also coming back recurrently in terms of Horizon 2020 and these types of publicly funded programs that absolutely should include this thinking. I mean, I'm saying as an external observer, I'm either a researcher here nor a regulator. I wonder what Prabhat has to say, but definitely it's something that funders of public research should have in mind. I don't know if they do.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, but I think that your question was probably not so much about publicly funded research that's going on, but actually about the tech industry practice itself, whether that should be subject to prior authorization due to kind of in the same way that biotech experiments by private companies have to be pre-approved. Is that what you wanted to? Yeah, I think so. We're not there yet, but it's definitely an interesting avenue of thought for publicly funded research. Even if it's carried out by private companies, there is an ethical screening, and data protection aspects are a mandatory part of that screening. So if you want to get R&D money from the European Commission, even as a company as Facebook or some other company, and that involves data protection relevant issues, you have to do a screening. Otherwise, you don't get the money. But whether the industry itself should be subject to such screening is a good question. I don't have a good answer, but it's something that's worth examining.
Anyone else want to? Okay, next question. Let's see where Kevin has the microphone. Right over there.
Hi. I was wondering, Kasia said that this new ecosystem, part of it should come bottom up. So I was wondering, as citizens, what can we do to try and help push things in the right direction? Should we be weaning ourselves off Google and Facebook and all these things?
In the ecosystem, I imagine I do not assume movement of people outside of these networks. I think that could be a consequence of a new version, a federated version. So once you have a federated one, then there are places where we can move. But before we create it, it's rather forcing these companies to open their APIs to the level where we can experiment and add new layers, new alternative services on them, to start with something. Like, for example, there is a lot of discussion around newsfeed, how messy, how uncomfortable, how human experimentation line of thinking, I will use it. You know, trivial the newsfeed, for example, is for a different one. Can I achieve it? Well, technically, yes, right? I can imagine API that this possibility, and then eventually we might imagine this as a federated structure where, yes, people could also move somewhere else. But right now they have nowhere to move, and we have to acknowledge this.
I think what the point you raise, I have a slightly different perspective, but you know, I don't want to contradict Kasia because she's got great ideas. But I think that the power of users to take their business elsewhere is really enormous, and you shouldn't underestimate that. You know, like it's a really powerful factor in changing companies' behavior. You know, much more I think than regulators think. You know, and we know this from documents about, you know, strategy documents about how to counter WeChat or how to counter Snapchat and so on. You know, like, this is a really important thing. So conscious consuming, you know, like is really a hugely important factor, and you do have choice. You know, like an agency, and one of the things that we want to also say is that, you know, you're not. Sometimes what I get a little bit frustrated with in conversations in Brussels, in my bubble, is that that users are represented as kind of purely passive, you know, like that they are just kind of victims of what is thrown at them, and they have like zero agencies. And I think maybe we're simultaneously over and underestimating the agency of the users. You know, like sometimes in some aspects we think that they can do more than they can reasonably do in an attention economy. But in other cases, I think consumers do have a choice. You know, and they can make a conscious a choice when you pick your food and when you pick your clothes. You know, you take conscious choices. You know, you can also do some of that online. And educate yourself, and this is something that is really something as part of the conversation. It's not only about regulation, it's also about empowering people and educating users, you know, and I'm actually very optimistic. I see it when we work in the little bit of work we do with kids, and we should be doing much more, is that we actually are aware of a much higher level of awareness than we sometimes assume about the dangers and so on, and their usage patterns are different from what the kind of, you know, Lambda user in the policymaker's head is, and that's an important part. So maybe I'm overemphasizing, over optimistic, but I do think this is an important part of the conversation.
I would emphasize Prabhat's last point about read about this, like talk to your friends about these issues, get more interested, look into how these platforms are designed to capture your attention and keep you there, because I deleted my Facebook account a year and a half ago, haven't missed it for a day. We might there might be some examples where we don't really have alternatives, and you'll ask yourself, yeah, but then where do I go? But ask yourself also, do I really need it? Could I be spending my time somewhere else on the internet that is more creative for me, more participatory, more, and yet just don't, let's have this conversation be more mainstream than it actually is.
Just to clarify my point, that nowhere to go does not refer to lack of other brands or services. I mean the business model. If the business model everywhere is more or less the same, we really have nowhere to go. So that's what I mean, and that's why I think we need to rethink ecosystem so it becomes not service-driven but value-driven.
Yeah, I think we have time for. That's all the time we have? Okay, well, that's all the time we have for this panel. But
it's pretty late. Let's take one more.
Yeah, we'll do one more. We'll do one more. Hand up back there. Yeah, that's a good call.
My question for the panel is, should EU policy support the concept of digital generativity? And by that, I mean the idea that if you do things like interoperability and decentralization, you can enable uncoordinated audiences to collaborate and generate unplanned innovation. The classic example is the Payment Services Directive 2, whereby mandating open APIs for banking and also allowing users to take their data, that at least in theory allows new third parties to come up with new services and makes the EU much more competitive compared to the US, where banking's in the Stone Age. Sorry, French.
I'm all for it.
Yeah, simple answer, yes, absolutely. And it's great that you raised the PSD too, because that's one example. But there's another example for in EU telecoms law now. There is the power for regulatory authorities to force interoperability between chat apps, between, say, WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram and so on. Is that something that they're going to be using or not? But definitely having that as a policy goal to help create that interop and that decentralization, we're all in favor, for sure.
Now.
Yeah, I mean, so and we're pretty proud of those the innovations in the interoperability space that you both mentioned, and I think that's something that we want to build on. I just have a small word of caution in there, is that interoperability really works well when you have kind of two equivalent things that you can really connect to each other. Like the and in the banking system and or in net neutrality regulations, you deal with. You deal with things that you can easily interconnect because they're basically the same. It's not super trivial to take that concept and to take it to kind of very heterogeneous systems. Like Mastodon and Facebook are kind of very different things. And so while the principle of interoperability and decentralized kind of thing is really good, how to make it work in practice, I think this is something that requires a little bit more conversation. I think there's an interesting standard which was proposed a couple of years ago by W3C about social media, news feeds and so on. That was designed to enable this kind of decentralized federation. And I think we're going to take a fresh look at that and have a better understanding of what was what happened to that and so on. So. Yes, in principle, slight word of caution on how would this work in practice.
One of the takeaways from discussions here in this space was let's take step-by-step approach. Maybe start with the lower hanging fruit, like federating the public posts without discussing private groups or private messages that are more difficult. So also that could be like the banking directive. It doesn't really open the whole ecosystem. It opens just one layer, but that's already a big breakthrough, right? So we could take the similar approach here.
All right, I think that's all the time we have. So big round of applause for our panelists today on stage right now and all day today. That is our show. This is the end of Mozilla MozFest 2019. I'm Xavier Harding, and see you guys soon.
See you.
Yeah, thanks everybody.